Welcome back to Attorneys on Call. One thing we're going to talk about right now is hernia mesh. And if you've had hernia surgery, quite likely you have had a mesh implanted in the surgical process. Some people are having a lot of problems with that. Whitney Butcher from Whitley Law Firm is going to offer up some new information about this. And Whitney, I know this is an area that you have a lot of experience working in now. And tell us the latest on what's going on with this, because we've seen some things in the news about hernia mesh and a lot of lawsuits that are coming out about this. And I know you've got some clients you're representing that are having issues as well. So kind of fill us in on where things stand right now.
Sure. So a couple of months ago, Drew, we talked about hernia mesh cases, and specifically we were discussing a voluntarily withdrawn hernia mesh called the Physio Mesh, manufactured by Ethicon, which is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. Okay. Then another composite mesh, which is called the Secure, manufactured by Atrium. Those are called composite meshes because they're made up of several different types of material, but inherently they have a polypropylene core and then some sort of coating or surrounding material that's intertwined with it. The theory and the issue with those cases, the reason why they were withdrawn by Ethicon is because the coating breaks down and the polypropylene is exposed to the human tissue, and those are two incompatible materials. So there's an inflammatory response, scar tissue builds up, and then you can start to see the mesh degrading in the human body. So a hernia is what it's there to treat. If the mesh is placed, it may begin to entwine in the abdominal wall, cause bowel obstructions, recurrence of the hernia, or severe infections. So those were the two initial types of meshes that we were looking into. As we've talked with experts more and started to look at more cases, it's expanded pretty significantly beyond that.
Really?
So it's not just these composite meshes. We're talking about patches, flat pieces of mesh. There's all different types of plugs and sort of different mechanisms that these hernia mesh are taking. So it's not just the composite meshes that we're concerned about now. We've opened it up a lot more now that we're seeing some of the complications folks are dealing with.
So hernia surgery is pretty common, right? A lot of people have it. In fact, I have a loved one who's going to be having a hernia surgery within the next month.
Sure, and that's a great point. So hernia mesh has been used for decades, right? And there's a lot of instances where it causes no problems, where that particular mesh is used appropriately or properly. So you've got two surgical procedures that you can place a hernia mesh: the laparoscopic, which is minimally invasive, or an open procedure. Depending on the type of mesh that you're using, it may be appropriate for an abdominal hernia that's an open procedure, but it may not be appropriate for a different type of hernia and a laparoscopic procedure. Okay. So, I mean, just because you have a hernia mesh doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have problems. They're not all faulty, they're not all bad, but there's some that we're really looking into that are causing folks some real harm.
If people have had hernia surgery and you're watching this program right now, what do you advise them to do? Should they call you?
Absolutely. If someone's had hernia mesh placed and you generally know that you've had hernia mesh used, you may not know what type, but if they've had a hernia mesh placed and they're experiencing pain, recurrence of the hernia, they've had revision surgeries or infections, I would encourage them to give us a call, because it may be a case. There's 4 major manufacturers and a couple dozen of different types of mesh products that we're looking into, and we can meet with them. I can meet with them. We'll get their medical records and take a look to see if it's one of these hernia mesh products we're concerned about, and whether it's one of the mesh products that was used improperly and correctly that could have caused the complications the person's having.
And so these are situations where the doctor is not at fault here. The doctor is doing the surgery here, but the actual mesh piece itself is become faulty.
That's right, Drew. So these are cases against the manufacturers of the mesh, not against the physician or the hospital or anything like that. These mesh products were approved through what's called the 510K approval process. That's an FDA approval process where medical device manufacturers submit limited information about their product and it gets approved. Then they learn, once it's in the marketplace and being used in patients, we're getting a number of adverse event reports for this type of complication. Okay. We're seeing more infections here. So that's why Ethicon voluntarily withdrew the Physio Mesh in May of last year because there were so many adverse event reports, and folks were complaining of having to have revision surgeries and corrective surgeries. So, you know, it's not against doctors or hospitals. At the time, a lot of our clients were having the meshes implanted in 2012, 2013. The doctors were using the products as instructed by the companies and as they thought was appropriate. So,
can you share with us any personal examples of clients that you're working with right now that are undergoing some problems?
Sure. So there's one lady who's very sweet and full of life, bubbly. She's retired, spends a lot of time with her husband. And she had a hernia repair surgery a couple years ago.
Surgery.
It was
okay.
it was a minor hernia. They used the mesh. It was one of the Physio Mesh, so it was the composite.
Okay.
It started to break down, and she's had 5 surgeries.
Wow.
They were finally able to remove all of the mesh after those many surgeries, and she's left with a huge bulging hernia that she has to wear a wrap around her waist all the time, because otherwise she describes it as being like a watermelon. It's just like loose skin. That wasn't there before she had the mesh placed. So it's a foreign substance you're putting in the human body. They don't mix well all the time, and you can have some severe complications.
Bob, I've heard you talk about this in the past, that I think the term you like to use is profits over people.
Yes, I think a lot of these problems like the hernia mesh, like the granuflow cases that we're handling, and some that we've handled in the past is a direct result of these companies making so much money on these products that they're not careful enough to test them appropriately and issue warnings to the physicians that are using those products of some possible complications.
Because if they disclose all the warnings and possible side effects, it may cut into their market share or how widely it's being used.
And this probably ties into the Whitley advantage as well, because part of the allure and part of having a smaller firm like yours to represent people is the fact that you're going to get that one-on-one personal care. You're not at some massive wholesale firm where you're just kind of a number, right?
That's right. So folks will call me with a hernia mesh case, for example, and they'll have seen the national advertisements with a phone number. And they'll call us and say, you know, I spoke with someone, they weren't a lawyer, they're way in from North Carolina, they're on the West Coast, and if they decide to move forward with that law firm, that may be a fine decision, but it's more likely that they won't talk with an attorney, they won't meet with someone in person, and they won't have that type of relationship. Some of the Mass Tort clients call me, and I recognize their phone number when it comes up on the caller ID. So you're getting a much more personal relationship with us than maybe some other larger firms.
Bob, you want to add to that?
Well, only that, you know, it's not by accident that Whitney knows so much about these products. She studies them, she goes to meetings all across the country to learn more about them, and I think you're going to one real soon.
That's right, next week. So there should be even more information. We've been handling the Xarelto cases for a while. That's a blood thinner that was causing real severe bleeding events. The first Xarelto trial starts next week in the MDL in Louisiana, so hopefully we'll have a lot more information and updates when I get back from that.
And so this is another thing that your firm can do, is you can spend the time needed to do the research and educate yourselves on these, whereas some of these big wholesale firms aren't really doing that.
Well, they're doing the research, but it's on the grander scale, right? It's the clients sort of fit what they think is the larger issue with a product or the drug. Here, I feel very strongly that we're able to give more attention to our clients.
Very good. We're going to take a short break. Back with much more of this edition of Attorneys on Call.